The story of the Beatles' songwriting genius does not begin in a pristine recording studio. It begins in the damp, crowded, and electrifying atmosphere of clubs in Liverpool and Hamburg. In these formative years, from the late 1950s to their breakthrough in 1962, the band was a formidable live act, basically a human jukebox. Their set lists were a vibrant tapestry of American rock and roll, rhythm and blues, and Motown hits. Night after night, they relentlessly performed songs by Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Larry Williams, and the Shirelles. This intense period of playing other artists' material was, in a way, their apprenticeship. It was here they dissected what made a great song tick, absorbing the structures, the hooks, and the raw energy of the music they loved. They weren't just mimicking, they were really learning their craft from the inside out, gig after gig. The transition from a cover band to a group of original songwriters was driven by both ambition and necessity. John Lennon and Paul McCartney, even in their teenage years, harbored a desire to be like their idols. Goffin and King or Lieber and Stoller professional songwriters. They began collaborating, often sitting opposite each other with acoustic guitars, working out melodies and lyrics. The initial catalyst for recording their own material came from the stark reality of the record industry. To secure a recording contract and stand out from the countless other beat groups, they needed their own songs. Their manager, Brian Epstein, and eventually producer George Martin, recognized that originality was really the key to unlocking their potential and securing a lasting career beyond the fleeting fame of the club circuit. Their first original song to be released, Love Me Do, was a statement of intent, albeit a modest one. It was simple, direct, and built around a harmonica riff that just lodged itself in the listener's ear. This was followed by P.S. I Love You, and then, crucially, Please Please Me. This track, with its clever wordplay and surging energy, was the one that convinced George Martin they had something truly special. The process was gradual. Their early albums, and were a mix of their own compositions and the cover songs they had perfected on stage. This blend showcased their roots, while simultaneously pointing towards a future where their own names would be the ones credited on the record label. The decision to write their own songs was a pivotal moment that separated the Beatles from their peers. While many other bands relied on professional songwriters from Tin Pan Alley, Lennon and McCartney were determined to forge their own path. This autonomy gave them complete creative control over their identity and their sound. It allowed them to write songs that reflected their own experiences, their own wit, and their unique Liverpool perspective. The early compositions were often simple love songs, mirroring the popular themes of the day, but they were infused with a personality and melodic instinct that was entirely their own. This foundational step was the bedrock upon which their entire revolutionary career would be built, a journey from imitation to, honestly, unparalleled innovation. When the Beatles first entered EMI's Abbey Road studios in June 1962, they were met by a man who would become an indispensable part of their musical journey, George Martin. A classically trained musician and a producer with a background in comedy records and orchestral music, Martin was not an obvious match for a scruffy rock and roll band from Liverpool. Yet his open-mindedness and musical expertise proved to be the perfect foil for their raw, intuitive talent. He saw beyond their rough edges and recognized the nascent genius in their songwriting. His initial role was to translate their ideas into professional-sounding records, making sure the arrangements were tight, the harmonies were polished, and the overall sound was commercially viable for the 1960s pop market. But Martin's influence extended far beyond the technical aspects of recording. He became a trusted collaborator and musical mentor, particularly in the band's early years. He would listen intently to the simple guitar and vocal demos John and Paul presented to him, and suggest subtle but crucial enhancements. This could involve changing the tempo, as he famously did by speeding up Please Please Me, transforming it from a slow ballad into an energetic chart topper. He also refined their song structures, suggesting the addition of an introduction or a more impactful ending. His most significant early contribution was often in the arrangement, deciding which instruments should play which parts to create the most dynamic and pleasing sound for the listener. As the band's confidence grew, so did the collaborative nature of their relationship with Martin. He was the one who could realize their increasingly ambitious and abstract musical ideas. When Paul McCartney heard a string quartet in his head for Yesterday, it was George Martin who had the classical training to write the score, and arranged the recording with the musicians. When John Lennon wanted Strawberry Fields Forever to sound like something from a dream, Martin, along with engineer Geoff Emerick, used innovative studio techniques including varying tape speeds and splicing two different takes together to create the song's otherworldly atmosphere. He was their musical translator, turning imaginative concepts into sonic reality. Martin never imposed his will on the band, rather, he facilitated their vision. He provided the formal musical knowledge they lacked, introducing them to classical instruments like the piccolo trumpet on Penny Lane or the Swarmandal on Strawberry Fields Forever. He acted as a crucial sounding board, offering constructive criticism and pushing them to refine their best ideas. The Beatles were brilliant songwriters, but without George Martin's guidance, their development might have been slower and their records less polished and inventive. His role as the fifth Beatle is not hyperbole. It is a recognition of his profound and integral contribution to their sound and their evolution as artists. The musical evolution of the Beatles is a remarkable journey from harmonic simplicity to sophisticated complexity. Their earliest self-penned hits, such as Love Me Do or She Loves You, were built on a foundation of standard rock and roll chord progressions. They primarily used the three main chords of a key, the tonic, subdominant, and dominant, or 1-4-5, which provided a solid and familiar structure for their infectious melodies. The songs were direct, energetic, and perfectly crafted for the pop charts of the era. The melodies were catchy and memorable, often moving in straightforward steps, but even here there were hints of the ingenuity to come, like the surprising G major chord that opens She Loves You on a C major vocal harmony. As they progressed, particularly around the time of the And albums, a noticeable shift occurred. The Lennon-McCartney songwriting team began to explore a richer harmonic palette. They started incorporating minor chords and more adventurous chord changes that added new emotional depth to their music. A clear example is Michelle, From, which features a sophisticated descending bass line and moves through several key changes, with a fluency that was, honestly, uncommon in pop music. Similarly, John Lennon's In My Life uses a clever chord progression that creates a feeling of poignant nostalgia, a far cry from the exuberant simplicity of I Wanna Hold Your Hand. Their melodies also became more nuanced, featuring larger leaps and more intricate contours. By the time they reached And, the Beatles were operating in a different musical universe. Their chord progressions became highly unconventional, borrowing chords from different keys and experimenting with modal harmony. Paul McCartney's For No One features a sequence of chords that constantly shifts the song's harmonic center, perfectly mirroring the lyrical theme of uncertainty in a fading relationship. John Lennon's I Am the Walrus is a masterpiece of harmonic ambiguity, with its seemingly random yet brilliantly effective chord changes and complex augmented and diminished chords. The music was no longer just for dancing, it demanded active listening to appreciate its intricate construction. This increasing complexity was not just for the sake of it, it was always in service of the song's emotional core and lyrical narrative. In Penny Lane, Paul McCartney uses a surprising pivot to a B major chord to musically illustrate the line "The banker never wears a Mac in the pouring rain," creating a moment of bright, almost surreal clarity. The intricate weaving melodies of Eleanor Rigby and the shifting time signatures in Strawberry Fields Forever were groundbreaking innovations that expanded the very definition of what a pop song could be. This journey, from the three-chord tricks of their early days to the avant-garde arrangements of their later work, remains honestly one of the most astonishing creative developments in music history. A fascinating aspect of the Beatles' songwriting prowess is that none of the four members could read or write conventional musical notation. This fact often surprises people, given the immense complexity and sophistication of their later work. Their creative process was not based on theory or formal training. It was rooted in instinct, experimentation, and an incredibly well-developed musical ear. They composed on their instruments, guitars and piano, finding chords and melodies that sounded right to them. This method, far from being a limitation, may have been one of their greatest assets. It freed them from the established rules of music theory, allowing them to explore unconventional chord combinations and melodic ideas that a formally trained musician might have dismissed as incorrect. Their inability to read music meant that collaboration and memory were essential. When John and Paul wrote together, they would play their ideas to each other, building the song layer by layer in real time. To remember their compositions before they could be recorded, they had to rely on their own memory or make rudimentary home demos on small tape recorders. In the studio, this translated into a hands-on practical approach. They would demonstrate the parts they wanted each other to play by singing or playing them on an instrument. This process fostered a deep, intuitive understanding of the music within the band, as each member had to internalize the song's structure and feel rather than simply reading notes from a page. The role of George Martin was pivotal in bridging the gap between their intuitive ideas and the world of formal music. When Paul conceived the string arrangement for Yesterday, he hummed the melody lines to Martin, who then transcribed them into musical notation for the string quartet. Similarly, for the complex orchestrations on, the Beatles would describe the sound or feeling they wanted, like a circus or getting higher and higher, and Martin would use his classical training to translate these abstract concepts into a full score for the session musicians. He was their conduit to a musical language they couldn't speak but deeply understood on an emotional and aesthetic level. Ultimately, their lack of formal training did not limit them, it liberated them. It encouraged a spirit of playful discovery and ensured that their music always came from a place of pure sound and feeling rather than academic exercise. They were not bound by the conventions of what was supposed to work, which led them to create chord progressions and song structures that were entirely new. Their legacy proves that musical genius is not contingent on formal literacy. It's about having an innate sense of melody, a relentless drive to innovate, and the creative courage to follow one's ear, even when it leads to uncharted territory. The decision to stop touring in August 1966 was one of the most significant turning points in the Beatles' career. The relentless grind of live performances had become a creative and personal ordeal. The deafening screams of the audience meant their music could barely be heard, turning concerts into appearances rather than musical events. This environment offered no room for subtlety or sonic experimentation. Ending their life on the road was an act of artistic self-preservation. It liberated them from the constraints of having to reproduce their music live with a simple 2 guitars, bass and drums lineup. Suddenly, they were no longer a touring band, they were studio artists, and Abbey Road became their new playground. This newfound freedom had an immediate and profound impact on their songwriting and recording process. Without the need to worry about live performance, they could write songs of any complexity and use any instrumentation they could imagine. This shift is immediately evident in the first song recorded after their final concert, Strawberry Fields Forever. The track is a complex tapestry of sound, featuring a swarm and doll, cello, trumpet, and backwards tapes, elements that would have been impossible to replicate on a stadium stage. The studio was no longer just a place to document a performance, it became an integral part of the composition process, an instrument in its own right. The period from late 1966 onwards saw an explosion of creativity. The albums, the White Album, and are filled with sonic textures and arrangements that were born out of this studio-centric approach. They could now spend weeks, even months, on a single album, meticulously layering sounds and experimenting with new recording techniques like automatic double tracking, flanging, and Barry speeding. Songs like A Day in the Life with its 2 distinct sections and cataclysmic orchestral crescendos, or Tomorrow Never Knows with its revolutionary tape loops, were direct results of this liberation from the stage. Their songwriting could become more introspective, more psychedelic, and more ambitious. This change also altered the dynamic within the band. With unlimited studio time, each member could work more independently on their own compositions, bringing in the others to add their parts when needed. While this sometimes led to fragmentation, it also allowed for a greater diversity of styles to emerge on their albums. George Harrison in particular blossomed as a songwriter during this period, having the time and space to fully develop his intricate compositions. The end of touring was the end of one chapter for the Beatles, but it was the beginning of their most innovative and artistically significant era, transforming the very nature of what a record could be. At the heart of the Beatles' creative engine was the legendary songwriting partnership of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Credited as Lennon-McCartney on every song they wrote, their collaboration was a complex blend of teamwork and friendly competition. In the early days, they often wrote eyeball to eyeball, sitting in a room with their guitars and hammering out songs together. One would come up with an initial idea and the other would contribute a middle eight, suggest a chord change, or refine a lyric. This dynamic created a perfect balance. McCartney's melodic optimism and structural prowess complemented Lennon's raw, introspective lyrics and penchant for unconventional melody. Songs like I Wanna Hold Your Hand and She Loves You were true 50-50 collaborations. As their careers progressed, their writing process became more individualized, though the spirit of collaboration remained. One of them would typically write the bulk of a song on their own, and then bring it to the other for feedback, or to help finish a tricky section. For instance, John wrote most of Help, but Paul contributed to the counter melody in the chorus. Paul wrote most of Hey Jude, but John's encouragement to keep the long chanting na 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 outro was a crucial contribution. Even on their most personal songs like John's Strawberry Fields Forever or Paul's Penny Lane, the other would often provide a small but vital piece of the puzzle, acting as a trusted editor and a source of inspiration. While Lennon and McCartney were the primary songwriters, George Harrison was steadily honing his own craft in their shadow. In the early years, it was a struggle for him to get his songs onto the albums, which were dominated by the prolific output of his bandmates. He was typically allocated 1 or 2 song slots per record. His early compositions like Don't Bother Me showed promise, but it was during the band's later studio-focused years that he truly came into his own as a world-class songwriter. Freed from the pressures of touring, he had more time to develop his unique musical voice, which was often more spiritual and harmonically complex than his partner's work. The challenge George faced was not necessarily a lack of support from the others, but the sheer volume and quality of the Lennon-McCartney catalog he was competing with. There were often disagreements and tense discussions about which songs would make the final cut for an album. For the Beatles, the White Album, George presented several excellent songs, but a masterpiece like Not Guilty was left off the record after more than 100 takes, only to surface on his solo album years later. Despite these hurdles, his persistence paid off spectacularly. By the time of Abbey Road, his contributions, Something and Here Comes the Sun, were not just included, they were widely regarded as 2 of the finest songs on the entire album, a testament to his remarkable growth and tenacity. The creative environment within the Beatles was not always harmonious. As the members matured and their individual artistic visions became more distinct, disagreements over musical direction and song choices became more common. These tensions were particularly evident during the sessions for The White Album and the ill-fated project which later became. One famous instance of discord involved Paul McCartney's Obla-Di Obla-Da. Paul's meticulous, perfectionist approach led to days of recording and re-recording the track, which frustrated John Lennon, who openly disliked the song's light-hearted granny music style. The tension was palpable, and it highlighted the growing creative chasm between the 2 principal songwriters. Similarly, George Harrison often had to fight to have his songs taken seriously. During the sessions, footage shows a now famous exchange where he tries to discuss his song I Me Mine with Paul and Ringo, only to be met with a degree of indifference. Another of his songs from this period, All Things Must Pass, a composition many now view as a masterpiece, was rehearsed by the band but ultimately rejected for inclusion. This sense of being creatively stifled was a significant factor in George's decision to stockpile songs, which would later form the basis of his massively successful triple solo album of the same name. These disagreements were not born of malice, but of strong artistic personalities pulling in different directions. When asked about their favorite and least favorite Beatles songs, the members' answers were often revealing. John Lennon was famously his own harshest critic. He expressed pride in songs like Strawberry Fields Forever and I Am the Walrus for their honesty and originality, but he frequently dismissed much of their early work, referring to Run for Your Life as a song he always hated and It's Only Love for its terrible lyrics. Paul McCartney has consistently named Here, There, and Everywhere as one of his personal favorites, and he held a particular fondness for Yesterday. Interestingly, the band's feelings could be complex. While John disliked Obla-Di Obla-Da, it was a song Paul was immensely proud of crafting. In conclusion, the Beatles' journey from a Liverpool cover band to the most influential songwriters in history is a story of relentless growth, collaborative synergy, and groundbreaking innovation. Their evolution from simple 3-chord pop to complex, genre-defying studio creations fundamentally changed the landscape of popular music. They legitimized the idea of the self-contained band that writes, performs, and records its own material. Their willingness to experiment, their melodic and harmonic genius, and their ability to capture the human experience in song created a legacy that continues to inspire musicians and captivate listeners decades later. The disagreements and personal favorites simply add color to the story, reminding us that behind the myth was a group of 4 distinct individuals whose combined chemistry produced something timeless.